Well, it's nice to see we've got a very, very dedicated crowd today. So to give you a quick overview, what we're going to cover, we're going to go over the basics. What is unconscious bias? We're going to talk about the formal definition. We're going to go over examples of unconscious bias. And then we're going to move into how it presents itself in the workplace and into the situations that we're all dealing with on a regular basis. And then we're going to move into ways to overcome and combat unconscious bias in the workplace. And those ways may involve individual action steps, steps that each of us can take, or steps that we can coach the managers we work with, the employees that we work with, the teams we work with to take and incorporate into their practice. And it might also include ideas regarding institutional infrastructure, different processes and procedures and actions that your organization as a whole, your business, may want to put into place. So we're going to cover it all in 1 hour. The definition of unconscious bias, don't worry, most of my screens are not this text heavy, but this one is because it's the formal definition of unconscious bias. So what is unconscious bias? It's the assumptions about social identities, such as race, sex, age, sexual orientation, religion, disability. So it's assumptions about those social identities that, without our awareness or conscious control, shape our likes and dislikes and our judgments about the ability, potential, and character of others. It exists because of our socialization, our experiences, our repeated exposure to images. It exists because of the stories we were told as children, the movies we saw as children, the parents we had, the teachers we had, the neighborhoods that we grew up in. That is the foundation of our unconscious biases. And the bottom line is we all have them. Every single one of us has unconscious biases of one sort or another. And the interesting part about it is that sometimes our unconscious biases are inconsistent with our stated values and beliefs. So we're going to talk about all this, use this as a sort of a springboard to really get to the root of what is this unconscious bias. I've had clients tell me consistently that, again, as I mentioned earlier, that they believe that it's the gray areas that really lead to issues in the workplace as it relates to harassment and discrimination. And those gray areas oftentimes are unconscious bias, because as I, again, mentioned earlier, unconscious bias often is the root of harassment and discrimination issues. So again, the thinking is that by raising awareness of unconscious bias, we may be able to prevent smaller issues in the workplace from becoming bigger issues. So when I present on unconscious bias, I like to start out with more of an objective understanding of how our minds work and what unconscious bias is. And that's because in my experience, I found that if you just jump right into bias and issues of bias, people tend to get a little bit on the defensive because we don't like to hear that we're biased, that we have unconscious biases. And so I think it is important to understand how our minds work, how our colleagues' minds work. And so we can do this by starting off by talking about what are called cognitive illusions. And really what this shows us is that there are multiple ways to see an object or situation, but we default to only one. And the way we default is based on, many times, our unconscious biases, our socialization, our experiences. Some might call it our baggage that we bring to a situation. So these cognitive illusions, which rely on our stored knowledge, result in different people seeing different things. Whether you're looking at the same object and one person sees it one way, another sees it another way, or whether you're looking at the same situation. And I'm sure being in HR, many of you have that happen where you'll sit down and you'll have a coaching conversation with an individual and your takeaway is one thing, but the individual who is either the recipient of the coaching, their takeaway is something completely different. And it happens, and that's because, again, of our unconscious biases. So let's take a look at a couple of examples that will call our cognitive illusions into play. Take a look at this. What is the very first image you see when you look at this slide? So if the very first image you see was a vase, raise your hand. Okay. And if the very first image you see were two silhouettes looking at one another, raise your hand. Okay. So perfect example. We're all sitting in the same room, same slide, same lighting. Half of us see it one way, half of us see another. And when I did this presentation for my son last night, getting ready for this program, he saw a huge trophy. So again, it all goes to our perspective and how we're looking at things, right? The interesting thing is, and this is the great part about our human minds, is that you may have immediately seen the vase, but then your mind may have done it without me telling you or with me telling you that there's another way to look at this. You could then, in almost all instances, switch and alter the way you see something at will. Your conscious mind steps in and says, there's another way to look at this, just like there might be another way to look at the situations.